name is Michelle de la Luz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee. And, I'm only going to briefly introduce the panelists before they speak. I think everybody knows that there are wonderful bios here in this booklet, which gives additional background on everyone. Since we're the closing panel, this is the rubber meets the road panel. This is the panel where we can have a deep dive into the actual experiences of organizations on the front lines post-Sandy, and what are some of the lessons that we learned, and where can some of that capital that was talked about earlier make a real difference to make our residents and our communities and our organizations on the front lines more resilient. Just as a bit of background, so for those folks who don't know Fifth Avenue Committee, we're a nonprofit comprehensive community development corporation that's 35 years old, and our mission is to advance economic and social justice, and we're located, if you overlaid the surge maps for Sandy with Southwest Brooklyn, basically that's our primary catchment area. And one of the things that we do is we build and manage housing, and we manage 600 units of housing, and about a quarter of it was in evacuation zone A, and a high number of residents in our properties have special needs. So we were definitely on the front lines before, during, and after Sandy, serving nearly 1,000 folks that were impacted. And I think the panel here is really representative of the kinds of organizations like Fifth Avenue Committee that are on the front lines, and really the importance of the relationships and the support structures that exist within organizations, so that communities that can be very vulnerable, or people that are very vulnerable, can turn that vulnerability into strength and resilience, and the importance of networks that exist within the city, so that we can really deliver the kinds of services and supports that are needed following a storm. In the previous panel, we heard a lot about the importance of leveraging investments for multiple goals, and I think that's something that nonprofit organizations are particularly good at, because we do it all the time. And in this panel, we're going to reflect on what was learned from Sandy and the community and organizational levels by the folks that are on the front lines. And what the structure here is that every person on the panel is going to have about 5 or 6 minutes to share and reflect on their experiences following the storm. And then we're going to kind of go into more I have a couple moderated questions, and then we're going to definitely open it up for folks in the audience to ask some questions. So I'm going to actually first turn to Donald Manning, who's the Director of Housing at the Jewish Association for Services the Aging, because I think it'll be particularly helpful to understand what JASA's experience was immediately before and after the storm, and some of the lessons learned that you think are applicable from an organizational perspective, but also a citywide perspective, and what kinds of things can and should be supported moving forward.
Okay, good morning. JASA is an organization that's about 45 years old now. We serve predominantly the elderly in New York City. Serve about 1 million meals a year to homebound and frail. We have 2,000 units of housing, Far Rockaway, Brighton Beach, Coney Island, a couple of buildings in Manhattan, 24 senior centers throughout the city. And our basic mission is to help support the independence of the elderly, the wellness, community participation, and enhance the quality of people's lives in New York City, especially the elderly. I'm the Director of Housing, and when I took the job, I thought it was so amazing, these beautiful views from these apartments looking out to the ocean. Little did I realize how that view can change dramatically. I'm sure many of you here are nonprofits too, and experienced an amazing time during Irene. We were really on top of that. HUD is the agency that looks over us, and DHCR. And I, to this day, curse Irene, because before Sandy started up, we knew the storm was coming. We looked at, I saw a lady in the lobby on the weekend, and I saw her and I said, the storm looks pretty bad. And she said to me, Mr. Manning, You made me evacuate during Irene. I will not evacuate this time. So with that, and that was before the mayor called for the evacuation, we had our staff, all the social workers were calling their clients before the storm, even before the mayor announced it. We're making sure people were ready. This was another storm that looked significant, and we wanted people to be ready. Our staff at the buildings were, pulling out the plywood, putting up sandbags, getting ready, doing the best we could. I know HUD's here. I don't recognize anybody, but they even called me before the storm and said, "Do you have an emergency plan?" And I've pulled out my folder and I looked, yes, I have my 2-page plan. Little did I know that plan was completely useless. You plan for everything, but when in reality comes down, it was so different. And basically, we had my staff knocking on doors, porters, managers, social workers, everybody checked on doors once they called for the evacuation, and we were pushing people to evacuate. You've got to go, you got to go. This is serious, the mayor has mandated, and we put letters in Chinese and Russian and Spanish, and in some of our buildings we have PA systems, which we're now putting in most of our buildings, and tried to get people to really understand that this was serious. And then I live in New Jersey now, and basically left that afternoon and pretty much told my staff, well, just hold on tight and let's see what happens. And it was so much worse than we expected. I mean, I was getting calls through the night from staff calling me, supers in their apartments, watching the water circle around their buildings. We had guards, these are guys paid $8 an hour. At nighttime, holding back the plywood so the water for the front door would stay out. At one point at Coney Island, we had a woman that was pregnant in Seagate. Her home was completely destroyed. They knocked on our door and we opened up and we put them up into an apartment in one of our vacant units. It was chaos. And then trying to reach people and talk to people after that was impossible with what was happening. What I realized is we really have an amazing energy from our staff. People just rolled up their sleeves. I had staff that didn't sleep for 72 hours, really knocking on doors, bringing meals to people. So your staff really surprised you. But the other people that really shocked me were our partners in the government. Department for the Aging, really, it was amazing. Fantastic resource. They introduced me to that whole OEM office downtown Brooklyn. They were able to tap on people's shoulders and get us resources. Emergency generators were able to come to us through the Army Corps of Engineer. We have 2,000 apartments, and we had probably a 50% evacuation rate. We have people who have nowhere to go. These are elderly, many of them immigrants. Where are they going to go? And some of them had an awful experience during Irene at some of the shelters. The shelters just aren't ready for frail elderly. So we became, my guys, my women in these places, in these locations, porters, guards, became frontline first responders trying to do something they'd never been trained for. It was incredible. And then with partnerships from other folks, we were able to get help from, like I said, Army Corps of Engineer. National Guard was amazing. Those big vehicles brought 5,000 meals. We were distributing meals to tenants, blankets. But remember, we had no power. Building was dark. We had tenants on a 22-story building walking down the flights with a bucket, walking into the ocean so they could flush their toilets. It was really dangerous. That's really, do you want to talk any further about where we went from there?
No, I mean, that's great, and I'm just wondering, I think one of the pieces here, and you've already touched on it, was the role that the government and city played, and I think you've highlighted a number of examples of that. We're going to come back after but thank you for sharing that. Next, we're going to hear from Michael Whelan, who's the CFO of Services for the Underserved, another large organization in the city that serves a number of special needs residents.
Yes, and Donald and I didn't combat scripts beforehand, but my experiences around Sandy are almost exactly the same. Our population is not elderly, it's formerly chronically homeless with mental illness or developmental disability. But in effect, Sandy hit SUS the same way as it hit Donald. I'll try and take the conversation to another place here as well. SUS is a decent-sized social service agency. We have about 100 million in revenue. Because we're a not-for-profit, we have about $99.5 million each year of costs. So we have scale. We have 1,000 staff members, and we have 1 million square feet of housing under management. Half of that is owned, and half of that is leased from 165 landlords. You can imagine what fun we have leasing from 165 landlords. We have about 2,000 people in that supportive housing, very much similar in scale to Donald. We have a facility, 71 people, chronically homeless, formerly mentally ill, co-occurring substance disorder in the Rockaways, 3 blocks from the boardwalk. We evacuated when Mayor Bloomberg put the instruction out, and we had an evacuation plan. The evacuation plan was written subliminally, I think, on the basis that you evacuate, then you go right back. It wasn't written based on an evacuation that in the end took 11 months, and that was quite dramatic. So our learning really was evacuation plans need to take into account the amount of time practically it takes to respond to these storms. Of course, we too were lured into a sense of false security by Irene. What went really well was the response to the exposure at the building. We immediately took people out of their current jobs, 2 very strong managers, and said, forget your current jobs, you are in charge of this facility for the next 3 months to stabilize it. And we gave them authority on the ground to commit funds and to commit resources to actually take out the debris and do all the mold remediation. So within about 3 weeks, the building was totally dry and totally mold-free, but it took a commitment of resources that typically not-for-profits don't have. And at this stage, we didn't know where the money was coming from. You walk around the building after the disaster and you say, why didn't we move that equipment upstairs? It's portable. We could have taken it upstairs. We could have emptied the cafeteria and put it up on the mezzanine level. We could have pushed the button on the elevator and sent the car to the top floor, not left it on the ground floor. So you learn from your experience. It's important to institutionalize that knowledge and put it into the resiliency plan. On the recovery side, as I said, we didn't know where the money was coming from, and this one building took $4.5 million to recover and pay for the transition cost for the people in temporary accommodation. So we put 2 administrators on the process to manage our relationship with these new funding sources. FEMA, the federal SBA, the Office of Mental Health, all the government agencies that were involved. And I have to say, we had a great experience, despite what you read in the press. We had a great experience with FEMA, and that process went very well. Maybe we were lucky, but maybe as well the resources that we put onto it really helped us to navigate this totally new government bureaucracy. And it looks like we're going to get out of this experience at 100 cents on the dollar. Resilience is a different story. We availed of the rapid repair project that Mayor Bloomberg put in and got our furnaces and our electrical panels replaced by the city free of charge really quickly. But the policy there was to put it back in place where it was. That was the practice of rapid repair. So it was great to get the repairs done. It wasn't so great then to have to retrofit for resiliency later on. So now we're talking about floodgates and submarine doors and all that good stuff. We are putting a generator up on the roof, but with the help of enterprise community partners, we've got 5 of our major buildings now under a resiliency study. That resiliency study will tell us how to address resiliency in aging housing stock. Some of our buildings are more than 100 years old. Some of them are 12 months old. It all depends. That project will educate and inform and give us the know-how inside of the organization on how to, over time, build a resiliency into our infrastructure. We deal with a fragile population. we have to have resiliency, but that's a journey. But first of all, it's an education. I think I'll leave it there.
No, thank you very much for those reflections. I can tell you some of the property that we had that was impacted is actually affordable mixed income cooperatives, and we haven't quite had some of the same success in dealing with some of the government agencies because of some of the challenges specific to cooperative ownership. I'm going to now turn to our two panelists who represent intermediary organizations, enterprise community partners here in New York City, and the local initiatives, LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, Bomee Jung, and Denise Scott. And I think both, Fifth Avenue Committee has a relationship with both organizations, and I think we're very, very fortunate to have intermediary organizations here in the city that have been tackling some of the post-Sandy follow-up from different perspectives, and I think complementary perspectives from the perspective of both organizations that are on the ground and then contributing to a citywide dialogue. So I'm going to ask Bomee to go first and just reflect on how was it that Enterprise prepared itself and its network of organizations for Sandy, either immediately before or since the storm.
Thank you, Michelle. And hello, everybody. So for those of you who are not in affordable housing, I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is a national affordable housing organization, and we basically do three things. We work on housing policy both at the federal level and through our 10 local market offices to help create a policy environment and a regulatory environment that's conducive to investing in affordable housing and then supporting low-income communities. Secondly, we direct capital to affordable housing projects through both the low-income housing tax credit program, in which we're a syndicator and provide equity, as well as through other public-private partnerships and loan programs and such. And thirdly, we, like LISC, work on capacity building for the affordable housing field. And that comes both in the form of supporting specific affordable housing organizations like FAC, SUS, and JASA, as well as working to come up with tools that are available to the affordable housing field at large to help folks basically do the job that they do better. We believe sort of fundamentally in two things. One is that the affordable housing organizations that steward the stock of affordable housing that we have in this country are basically sort of keystone species in a sense, that they are very critical organizations. Studies have shown that affordable housing that's owned by nonprofit affordable housing or community-based affordable housing organizations tend to be the ones that are preserved for the long term as affordable housing. So that's one reason why it's very important. And we also believe that housing is sort of a fundamental good that as a society that we need to really safeguard and to provide access to, because having secure housing is the basis on which individuals and families are able to build their personal and economic successes. And so, if you're trying, and I think that this is borne out through studies by, folks like the, I totally just blanked out on the name. There's an organization that is an umbrella organization of human service agencies, Human Services Council, is that right? And they actually did a survey recently of their membership who were working on Sandy response, and they asked them, what are the things that have gone well, and what are the things that have been challenging, and one of the things that one of the primary findings in that report, and these are the human services agencies speaking, not the affordable housing owners, but they said is, the lack of having stable housing is preventing them from being able to deliver the services that they need to deliver to support these families' recovery. So, housing is really important. So, with that said, Enterprise, so we looked, when we, first of all, how do we prepare? We were not prepared. We were not prepared. We had, Enterprise itself, we had our, I think it was like 10-page, like emergency plan, and it really was inadequate.
It's 5 times longer than
Well, I think yeah. So that is what it is. But what we did do was, you know, we went out and, you know, sort of thought about how can we do the things that that support long-term recovery. So we knew that, you know, right at the get-go, there were a lot of resources that were going toward immediate recovery, and that's great. But what we're really focused on is building the long-term capacity of affordable housing organizations to sort of thrive in this new, you know, landscape where now we have this new climate risk that we really have to focus on, right? Enterprise has had a sustainability program since 2004, and largely it's been focused on climate change mitigation, so energy efficiency, green building, things like this. And I think that this, Sandy was really the first experience for us where we really made the connection between you know, sustainability and climate change, you know, mitigation and climate change adaptation needing to sort of come together. And so we basically are focusing on doing sort of three things. One is we're doing our best to elevate the needs of the low-income community and sort of the successes and challenges of the affordable housing delivery system in particular in the public dialogue that we have. So we've been doing data reports that look at both publicly available data as well as some research that we have commissioned that look specifically at how are low-income families faring in this recovery. One of the things that we found in our commission study is that, you know, as you might suspect, families that have fewer economic resources it's taking them longer to recover. So across the board in the affected region, about 40% of the folks who were affected by Sandy have said that, or had property that affected by Sandy, have said that they've been able to build, or have not been able to build back fully, which is, you know, a year out. Frankly, I think what we would have expected. But we're also seeing that if you look at the low-income population, that's fully half of those folks have not been able to build back successfully. So now we're starting to see that gap between folks who have access to resources and folks who don't. The other thing that we're doing is we're focusing programmatically on supporting the affordable housing organizations and figuring out how to unearth some of these lessons learned and best practices and share them with the affordable housing community at large. And so we're doing that primarily through our Sandy Learning Collaborative, which is brought together 12 portfolio owners of affordable housing in New York and New Jersey. And they are sort of really intensively working on their organizational preparedness, looking at how to prepare their portfolios for future crises, and at the same time, they're exchanging lessons learned and exchanging information to help that learning process progress more rapidly. And at the same time, we're working with that group to take those things, kind of put it into a form that's more accessible. So, you know, not every organization, has the resources to really, be able to do this in-depth planning. So we want to do as much as we can to sort of scrape off all of the things that, that are being elevated from that conversation, and to come up with tools that are very, very specific for affordable housing organizations, that are specific even to the level of job function, right? So we have a lot of manuals and things for preparedness, where you get like a big book and you get a really great overview of all of the things that have to happen to be prepared. And we suspect that some of those books just don't really get referred to very much, because it's not broken out by like who needs to worry about this particular aspect of preparedness, and how long is it going to take you to go through that exercise of doing that preparedness. So we're trying to sort of create these tools that are really specifically geared toward affordable housing organizations, specifically geared toward making that action happen. Am I out of time? Because I can just keep talking, but should probably wrap up. Yeah. So I want to finally sort of just get around to saying also that Sandy happened, and this has been a tremendous crisis for all of us. But we had an affordable housing crisis before Sandy happened, right? So this is sort of crisis upon crisis. The need for continued and frankly increased investment in affordable housing is shown both through the numbers of folks who are having to resort to shelter. It's shown by the incredibly low vacancy across the city, and particularly in the housing that's accessible to low-income people, like, at the Public Housing Authority in the affordable housing projects. And, I think that the panel before this one spoke about, sort of ended on a note about political will. We cannot take the resources that we have available to us for affordable housing for granted. We're in an environment where we all need to go out there and make our voices heard in support of the housing programs that have been successful, like low-income housing tax credit, like the HUD programs, because these are the resources that we have to continue to build this very important foundational resource of access to affordable housing.
Thank you, Bomee. I think you did a great job of highlighting the importance that an investment that was initially made specifically around affordable housing and the provision of safe and affordable shelter for a range of people was a tremendous resource, especially in the face of this storm, because without it, I think literally tens of thousands of additional residents would have overwhelmed a system that couldn't have handled it. Next, we're going to hear from Denise Scott, who's the Managing Director of New York City LISC. And LISC took a different perspective, one equally important related to Sandy, and I'd love to hear more from Denise.
Okay. Good morning. I'm happy to be here. So like Enterprise, we are a national organization. We're in about 31 places across the country and basically partner with various community-based organizations and private sector and government to move billions of dollars in financial investments to help fund everything from housing and schools and community facilities and the like. Here in New York and in the immediate aftermath of the storm, we tried to figure out what would be the most important role that LISC could play and building on the role that we've really played across New York for many years in partnership with our not-for-profit partners, what would make a big difference. And we realized that what I'm about to describe, I think, adds to Bomee's menu of resiliency, something we call that we all engage in, which is civic response, and the importance of what that meant to people in the aftermath of the storm, but also what it means in terms of long-term recovery and connecting people to resources. So like my colleagues, we immediately realized that the most vulnerable were the most vulnerable during the storm and afterwards, and that for many neighborhoods, this has become the new ground zero. That while well-resourced neighborhoods weren't spared, in many neighborhoods where there was already people struggling financially, people whose homes were financially underwater already or now literally underwater, and for many of our lowest income families, the issue of access to resources, which was already a struggle, for example, with healthcare in Rockaways and a host of other local amenities that just are overstressed in neighborhoods. But for many of our families, the storm not only did it hit hard, it also hit at a time of month where people have the least resources at the end of the month. So that was another big factor. Assessing all of that, we decided that perhaps the best contribution we could make is to partner up with our community-based partners in those areas. We created what we call the Hurricane Relief Fund, the goal of which was really to get up close with our community-based partners in those neighborhoods and to fund them in ways that would support their efforts to assist their residents. So the fund really had three main goals. The first was to expand the staff of these local organizations in places like Far Rockaway and Canarsie and Red Hook and other parts of Staten Island. So we literally helped people to hire new staff, outreach workers, rehab specialists, and to be able to go door to door and make sure that residents in their neighborhoods would get connected up to the resources that were becoming available. Again, like Enterprise, we took the long view that we had to be in this response for the long haul. So the fund was established. We assembled about $3 million specifically for capacity building. To date, we have put out the door about $1.2 million, and it's helped to fund staff in these various neighborhoods with these not-for-profits. Another part of the fund strategy was to deploy staff from parts of the city where the storm had not hit, but where there was strong not-for-profit capacity. So in some examples of this would be Affy and Manny, who ended up in parts of Rockaway and other parts of the city where they had not originally worked, in order to help build capacity there, because our goal was to try to get to fill in that capacity as quickly as we possibly could, and that was a strategy of putting talent to use where it was most needed. And then the other part of our strategy was sort of in line with what my colleague just said, which is to really figure out how to tie in very closely with our government partners. We hosted, for example, the FEMA Task Force for Not-for-Profit Participation, which was a way of sort of getting real-time information from government to our various partners. And for that, we actually were connecting up with partners not only in New York, but also in Jersey and in Long Island. So over the course of time, we've been able to reach several thousand households directly door to door, get on the other side of that door and do a couple of things. We are running for government and in partnership with 3 major philanthropies, the Mayor's Fund to Advance the City of New York, the Red Cross, and Robin Hood. We're running a mold remediation program, which was set up in advance of the flow of federal dollars and to enable families to both muck out, because there was a lot of that to do, as well as to treat mold. To date, we've treated mold in about 1,800 homes throughout Sandyland. And again, we're getting on the other side of the door, and when we're there to look at mucking out and mold removal, a business that is new to us, so we had to figure out how to muck. What we discover is that, and I think my colleagues all said this, is that much of what many families were dealing with were issues they were dealing with long before the storm hit. So we're finding elderly folks and disabled families and just, poor folks who really don't have the resources, who are not connected up, who are not in the loop, who aren't even getting messages that are on the airways all day long about government resources that are available. Even right now, many people have missed the deadline to sign up for federal funds, and we're literally calling people and knocking on doors to hear people tell us at this late date that they didn't know that there was a federal resource that they could have access to. So being able to get in deep with communities is really important. 2 other areas that we're about to work on, we're, as we speak, launching a small home repair program. We'll go back to some of the same homes that we treated mold in and do a full rehab, especially for families that do not qualify for federal funds, either because they may not have legal status here or because they didn't get the notice to sign up, so the deadline has passed, or for any number of other reasons. And then the other thing that we're going to be doing is, in partnership with CPC and Enterprise and HPD, we'll be targeting the smaller multifamily buildings in Sandyland, those under 100 units, and working hand in glove with those landlords. The overarching theme for us is to partner up with the local partners, as I said, to build up that capacity, to sustain it through the next couple of years, in order that we think this will help, and it's sort of already begun to help people get more connected in. And I think that the last part of what I'll say is that it is the level of we couldn't have been prepared. We all had our emergency plans that just didn't help us much. But I'm not sure that even with all the lessons we've learned so far, because you don't really quite know what neighborhood, obviously, the storm is going to hit in and what the issues in that neighborhood are. It's difficult to sustain an emergency plan to keep it current. And so I think part of our challenges will be to figure out how to do that. But probably one of the most important responses is to figure out how to marry people up to resources. And so that's what we did.
Thanks, Denise. So I just want to shift for a second. Everybody here touched on the importance of dedication, the importance of staying kind of focused on the particular constituents or residents or clients in response to things and taking both immediate action and a long-term view in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. So all of that could be described as characteristics of resiliency, but I guess I'd like to ask all of you to describe what you think the characteristics of a truly resilient organization, neighborhood, city are, and given those thoughts, what do you think is needed to allow our organizations, our communities, our staff to function, our residents and our properties, to function in an extreme crisis, while at the same time addressing many of the underlying issues we talked about, whether it's poverty, inequality, lack of access to certain things? I know it's a big question, but that's also part of what we're trying to balance here. So anybody who'd like to go first?
It is a hard one this time of the day, but I'll have the first stab at it. The way we're looking at this is it's a management problem for us, in the sense that resiliency is something that we hadn't focused on. A year ago, if you'd asked me about resiliency, I would have said it's a human condition, not an infrastructure or plant condition, if you like. So I think we just need to educate ourselves as organizations around resiliency, what best practices are, and tailor that, bring it into our organizations and apply it very rigorously. And there's not a cookie-cutter answer. A residence for developmentally disabled people in the Bronx is very different than a 71-unit apartment building 3 steps from the beach in the Rockaways. So first of all, we have to build a resilient organization which speaks to knowledge management and education. Secondly, we need to know how to tap into the available resources, many of which are in this room, and draw those resources into our organization to help us over time with the plan. As I mentioned as well, we're $100 million of annual revenue. We do have a capacity to prioritize where we spend our money. So if we feel that resiliency, an initiative around resiliency, can get funded outside, great, we'll go for that. But if it can't be, then we have to find a way to manage internal resources over time to take that resiliency step. But at the end of the day, we have to depend on some of the macro discussions that were going on in the previous panel, where $50 billion was a small number. Mm-hmm. We have a building in the Rockaways. We have to rely on the resiliency programs for the Rockaways more broadly to make our building resilient as part of the community of the Rockaways. We can't protect our own building from a surge the size of Sandy anymore. If it comes in at 10 feet, we'll be out. We'll be back in a lot quicker, but we'll be out. But whatever measures the city can take to protect that highly vulnerable space called the Rockaways is of great help for us, and we're very interested in what those steps are and how fast they can happen. So it's a menu of things, but first of all, it starts with internal focus and internal competency, I think.
Okay. Donald?
Before I forget, because my wife always tells me I need to remember who to thank. There are people who helped us with the resiliency that I really have to put out. We're a nonprofit, about $100 million too. We couldn't find $2 during that storm. All your resources are dedicated, and it's tough to get cash out. And people who stepped up we had 700 volunteers come in, bringing food, bringing help. We had the Fund for the City of New York really stepped up and gave us money right off the bat to start doing the muck out and doing the things. And we had partnerships with our vendors. They knew we were there. We've been working with them for years, and we had amazing staff. So I got to thank them. On the resiliency side, I think we were a little bit different, and the question is somewhat interesting for us. This may be the one area where we change. We have independent, just like you are, tenants. And I cannot go in there and put a handcuff around a person and drag them out of the building. The mayor said you got to go. They're independent and they had the right to stay. And it made it very difficult for a landlord, let's step away as a nonprofit, but just as a landlord to say, now what the heck am I supposed to do? I'm gonna jeopardize the safety of my people, and I have to take care of these people. And when the storm was out, we had our buildings up. The quickest was 3 days, the longest was 33 days. We brought in boilers, we brought in generators. But I think the trick is partnerships. Partnerships with nonprofits, other nonprofits, partnerships with foundations, and partnerships with the government. We have to establish those, and we have to know who we can call in that crisis moment. That's critical, and we got to find those out in advance. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And my feeling is nonprofits, I don't know how many are in here, but we have a responsibility to the communities as well, as a center of resiliency. I have my buildings in Coney Island, Manhattan Beach. They have senior centers in them. They have kitchens. We functioned as a hub. We had the Army Corps of Engineers delivering 10,000 meals from where we were then distributing them into the communities. We have a responsibility to the communities we're in. And somebody said something about the community boards. I think the nonprofits that are in these neighborhoods need to reach out to our community board members and partner with them. They're there, we're all committed to these neighborhoods, but we need to get to know each other a lot better.
Great, thank you for that. Denise and Bomee, do you guys want to comment on what you believe the characteristics of resiliency are for the organizations that you're connected to and for the communities that you're working in? And then, you know, I realize it's the big question, so maybe it's tough to answer, about how to address the issues, both immediate and long-term issues of resiliency, while also addressing the longer-term issues of poverty and inequality.
You know, what I would say is a truly resilient neighborhood is somehow prepared to stay connected to its residents, even when the normal systems are down. I think that's our challenge. And there's the partnerships, the coordination, you know, I guess I'd also say that resilient neighborhoods and revitalized neighborhoods are one and the same. At least they better be. And so to the extent that we can move as much as we can out of harm's way now, while we have at least maybe a few months, and to the extent that we could figure out a way to sustain this community engagement, which is not that easy, but I mean, I liken it back to the possibility that there is a way to have regular conversations about what went on, about what the immediate response needed to be in order to sort of get to the most vulnerable. And there's probably conversations that we could have in a sort of on a regular basis, so that when a storm hits again, we're ready. That this becomes a part of our routine to talk about how we respond immediately. For many people, some of what the now costs are to respond, to recover, is somewhat compounded by cost of not being prepared, right? So not just the physical, but just, you know, the social and a whole host of other things. So I think that we have to sort of make this a part of how we think about everything we do. Our business model has to be adaptive. And I think the point about the role of the not-for-profit as a sort of first line, first responder, we should all see this as our job. On the message of what to do about the sort of moving, I think people will, maybe the next time there's a storm threat, people will move, but then the next one they may not again, if you know, if it's an Irene versus a Sandy. So to some degree, at a point where we're in a vertical city, and my biggest concern about the whole evacuation thing wasn't even the people who sort of had some choices, even if, you know, but I was most concerned about, for example, the way public housing was evacuated. A vertical city, 50% of the population elderly. The strategy to move elderly people has to be a more thought out one, obviously. But I think once people begin, certainly in the aftermath of Sandy right now, we have the best opportunity to convince ourselves that we need to think differently and behave differently. So,
great, thanks.
Yeah. Well, so I'm sitting here just nodding vigorously to everything, and I agree with all of everything that's been said here so far. And I want to do two things. One is just on the question of, how our, what is it that housing organizations particularly need to do? I mean, obviously, just to turn it into cute little bullet points, right? The organization fundamentally has to be able to respond to the situation at hand, right? So if you've got flooded buildings, you have to be able to respond. If you have residents who have chosen not to evacuate, you have to be able to respond. So all of a sudden, a very complicated job has just gotten that much more complicated. The organization also has to do its day-to-day business, right? So we have to have the organization has to have a plan for how that day-to-day business is going to get made. Who are going to be the folks who are making decisions in the field? Who are the folks who are making decisions remotely? How is the staff going to be communicating? I mean, it's a very, you get into these details and it turns into just a huge list of things that you have to think about. But as I said, these folks do really complicated jobs and they do it well all the time. So, that's just another bullet point. We also have to invest and reinvest in both the affordable housing organizations and in the portfolios themselves so that they're better positioned to be able to provide the infrastructure that's needed in order to do these other two things. And lastly, back to my vigorous nodding, we all have to be sort of chronically connected to each other, right? Both as organizations and as individuals. And so, we're talking about engagement with residents, we're talking about engagement with the business community in the area, and Michelle has a really awesome story that I hope she'll tell about that, but about FACT's experience with that, with peer organizations, as Denise mentioned, in other parts of the city as well, and with our government partners. And on the point of the individual connection, I do believe that resiliency really means most as a term when we're talking about individuals and families. So on the point of on that point of individuals, if I might just hijack the room for 1 second, can I ask y'all to all stand up because I want to share the one thing that I learned about preparedness, right, at an individual level. And I'm not going to stand because y'all won't be able to hear me. So this is coming from very good sources. So when a crisis hits, you have to be the people who help yourselves and your loved ones, right? So just like we have stop, drop, and roll, right? We have something for emergency preparedness, right? And you got to do the arm movements with me because it's a little goofy, but it's less goofy if y'all are doing it together, right? So you check yourself to make sure that you're safe. You check your family and your loved ones to make sure that they're safe. And then you check your community. So how you go about figuring out how you're going to do this is part of what every individual has to figure out for themselves, right? Because, if you don't know your next door neighbor, you don't have to be best friends with your next door neighbor, but you have to have enough connection with them that you can go and check on them, right?
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you all for standing. So
thank you for humoring me with that. Y'all looked awesome.
no, that's great. So to that point, and I'm just gonna ask for kind of a really brief answer from everyone on this one, and then one last question. I'm gonna open it up. So to the points that were made. About the importance of physical preparedness, preparing in terms of the networks of people that we have and the kinds of relationships that you need to have with your neighbors and within your community in order to be effective. What would you say is the most important investment, given the theme of today's conference is financing an equitable and resilient future? What is the single most important investment you think either that your organization or that our government can make around this issue? We'll start here on my right.
I think our learning from Sandy would suggest that when we have a building in a community, we've got to turn that to a relationship and a footprint in the community. And I think Sandy was a kind of a quick awakening, and I think some other agencies might be more developed on that. But we house very specific populations in our buildings, and it's a full-time job for a housing manager in a particular location to just run that building. But we have to find a way to have regional staffing or local staffing that can reach out to the community and look beyond the four walls of the building. We do that now, but not enough of it.
Great, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to promote bureaucratic flexibility. I'll give you a couple examples. I needed a temporary boiler. I shipped it in from Michigan. It was the closest one I could find. I had to park it on the sidewalk. I couldn't put it there until I got a permit from the city. The other one is I was able to get, I was getting calls during the middle of Sandy, well, a couple of days after. For me, the whole year has been the middle. Not providing heat and hot water.
Yeah.
I was 10 feet underwater in that building, but still HPD came out and gave me a violation for not providing hot water and heat. I couldn't believe it. And then one of the government agencies that oversees us had a real hard time with us getting a 0% loan to enable us to recover because that was against the bureaucratic rules. And I said, look, this is something we need right now so I can get this work started to avoid mold problems. And it took almost 2 weeks to get back and forth in letters and emails, and finally they came around and said, all right, you know, that's really slow. We need some flexibility in these emergencies. And the one other one is, if there's a storm like Sandy coming, the elderly should be able to go to their pharmacy, even though they've got 3 days left on medications, to get another week's worth of medication, or 2 weeks. We are ready for a 3 and a 4 day storm. This was much longer. People should be able, what if you run out of your medication in the middle of this event? You're in a shelter somewhere. You should be able to go to your pharmacy before that storm hits, 96 hours, whatever the city council wants to come up with, but give people the ability to have a short refill of their prescription.
Great, thank you. Investments that you guys, single most important investment that you think can make to help make organizations and communities more resilient?
Well, one of my colleagues over there mentioned the quality of shelters. I think that's a big one. And I think that it speaks to why so many people decided not to leave their homes. So I think we have to rethink how we shelter people in the aftermath of disasters or storms and that sort of thing. And then the other thing I'd say is the role of philanthropy, to begin to, as they did here, they took the long view. I think to continue to take the long view is important. The tendency is to respond immediately, which is helpful, but the long view to be there with resources like today, as opposed to just a few days after the storm, makes a big difference.
Right.
So, I mean, I would echo that by saying, you know, when we started, well, I started, I mean, because, you know, I was new to this you know, topic area, this resiliency thing, just like probably most
Half the room.
right? And so, you know, I pulled out sort of like the nation's guidebook, right, which is the National Disaster Recovery Framework, right? And at the back, one of the awesome graphics that this document has is this like thing that's like beautiful rainbow colors, and it's amazing. And basically what it shows you is the timeline that the disaster folks think about, right? And there's like, you know, what we think about, which is a storm is about to hit us, it's hit us, and darn, we just got hit. And it's like there's this short timeline. The disaster people are asking us to think long term, right? And as Denise was saying, to invest in the infrastructure, to reinvest in the preparedness efforts at the organizational level, at the physical level. And I think that that's really the challenge in terms of financing. I think one of the things that we heard on the panel before this one is sort of the challenge of matching up sort of the timeline that financing has to think about versus the challenges that we're working with. And so I'm not 100% sure that financing in the strict sense is always what we need. And one of the things that I would hope that we don't do is I would hope that we don't go off and create a different stream of like money that's directed only toward now resilience, right? Because what we need is the fundamental goods. What we need is the housing. What we need is reinvesting in the successes that we already know we can achieve.
Great, thank you. So now I want to open it up to folks in the audience for any questions that you have of any of our panelists. We answered all the questions. Yeah, there's a microphone right here in the middle.
Bruce Rosa, this panel was extraordinary, including obviously asking everyone to get up, which I think is something that was very visible right after, within hours of 9/11. People were volunteering and doing things. So there's something in New York which seems to be a certain level of exceptional to the rest of the country. Maybe it's the intensity that people will roll up their sleeves, etc. My concern is... And
the value of that, if we had to put dollar value on what that meant to our communities and to government, it's extraordinary.
Well, that leads into one. You had some phenomena appearing, not just staff of your various developments, you know, doing things, figuring out things with the resources available. But you suddenly had the phenomena of Occupy Sandy coming up and being this extraordinary conduit to deliver supplies, food, to work with medical people to get to them. You had smaller organizations in areas of the most modest means, like the Red Hook Initiatives and good old Lower East Side, suddenly going into the rescue mode, where the city with great resources said, stay in place, don't worry, and then turning, its back. It suggests, and I wonder, one is, do we have to relook at, say, the way, what is the Department of Emergency Management, because that's the way the voters indicated, operates? If you looked at what were the evacuation routes, which didn't happen for Atlantic Coastal, Brooklyn and Queens. From Brooklyn, it's to Brooklyn College. How they would fit all those people there, I don't know. From the Rockaways, it's over the bay to York College in Jamaica. That's a good one. And it suggests to me that you need some sort of rethink. So I'm wondering what you would have to say of what do you think the city needs organizationally to handle such things, to provide for coordination, obviously to meet the things like medical and food needs and whatnot, and how these smaller organizations or the instantaneous things of people getting together can better coalesce, get better resources, can be more an integral part of the spirit of the city and how we do things.
I'm going to ask the folks that are lined up for questions if we can just hear all the questions, and then we'll hear responses. Hi.
My question is basically, it's not directly to Cindy, but it's still very valuable question. I'm here really representing my mother, who's 86-year-old and taking care of 3 non-functioning disabled daughters. My question is for Mr. Manning and Mr. Whelan. New York City is made up of different ethnic groups, and you are serving the most vulnerable people, especially the special needs people. Sometimes they cannot advocate for themselves, and they need caregivers like myself who can come and ask you those questions. My questions is related to what do you believe that your organization is doing enough to reach out or serve the different ethnic groups, especially when each of these ethnic groups has its own peculiarities? What I'm heading at, for example, in the Haitian community, I'm not speaking for all Haitians, but I'm speaking for my family right now. They don't want to go to help, get the help. They're so ashamed. When it's come to mental illness, they don't want to discuss it at all.
Great, thank you.
The burdens fall on me.
Right.
And my family need those help. I need to speak with someone who can respond to us right away. Not 10 days, and don't refer me, let me call some agencies, and then at that time, nobody's there, and they just kind of put you through so many bureaucracies, and you get nothing at the end.
Great, thank you. Stuart? Hi.
Hi. First, it was amazing to listen for me. Even those the little stories you tell that seems to be just a little story are, for those who don't know the story, extraordinarily telling. So the business, I'm an architect, but I didn't remember that the elevator should go up. Things like that. The bureaucracy, I do understand. I'm an architect. But I have fairly simple questions, and they're not very different than the first. I do have one other thing. If we ever do this again, you guys have to go first, and then the guys that do finance can figure out how to serve rather than you figure out how to do with what they've already decided. The question is a broader one and a bit of a frightening one, and that is, what percentage of the need do you think you serve? So there are 2 pieces of that. What falls through the cracks? And so the need in terms of serving people, in other words, your constituency, 1,000 units, we know what number that is in percentage, add another 1,000 units, it's still a small percentage. What does that really mean? And then, so that's the, what part is this very efficient group playing? And then in terms of your question about getting people together so that they relate to one another and can talk to one another, who can really do this? And I know we've all talked about it 100 times, but is that a private function? Is that another non-profit that says, we will coordinate all the nonprofits? Or is it finally a government process, and would you trust it if it were?
Great, thank you. Thank you. And our last question, and then folks will be able to answer.
Hi, I work for Jersey City Housing Authority, and one of the things, we have a large senior population. And one of the things that we've come across is the need to shift our thinking towards a shelter-in-place strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And so my questions, I guess, to the broader panel, and it's not just our senior population, although there it's the most obvious, because we are, dealing with public housing residents, that shelter in place is becoming a strategy that we think is a lot more sound than evacuation routes, that sort of thing. From the panel's perspective, what impediments do you see, either from a financing standpoint, a policy standpoint, just an ideology standpoint, are there to shifting our thinking towards shelter in place?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just to kind of recap, what should the city do in response to the different things that we heard? And the woman who spoke on behalf of her mother who was caring for elderly folks, and really kind of address the diversity that exists in the city. I mean, whether it's the organizations or the city as a whole, I think we could answer that question. And then getting folks together, whose role is that? And what percentage of the need are we meeting? And then the shelter-in-place question.
Just, one basic thing I think the city could do, city employees are deployed, they're mandated to come to work during a disaster, say the storm, but they're doing so without any real training, except for maybe if they work for emergency management. So many people show up at a shelter and they don't really know what to do. They just sort of clock in and they're there. They're not trained on how to assist families, on how to control crowds in shelters, so just some basic, regular, routine training that this is what you're supposed to do as a city employee. If you're deployed to work, then there should be a real role for you. And if I could just should I jump to another question?
Sure.
Just my last point on the sheltering in place, I think obviously this was a strategy that New York City used. I think it was relatively successful. The challenge is that the early money has to come in to stabilize the house or the apartment building, and that is the challenge of where that comes from. In our case, it came from philanthropy, so we were able to get in through the rapid repair program or the mold program and do the building stabilization. But without that very early money, it takes a while for CDBG funds to hit the table. So a city has to be able to call, I think, back to the sort of role of philanthropy in order to help with a strategy around, or to dedicate funds ahead of a storm that could be used for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Other folks want to opine on any of these questions?
I would just make a comment about homelessness first. There are 57,000 people homeless in New York City
Right now.
every night. We run a homeless shelter, and we're just starting in that field, and it has 165 beds, and it's a major commitment. It would take 250 of those shelters to accommodate those homeless individuals, that number I just referred to. And that's not an insignificant investment, and it's not an insignificant act of political will, in the sense that there's a lot of community opposition, obviously, to shelters. I don't think that's a longer-term solution. I don't think it is the solution. I think the model that seems to work is affordable housing. And with safe, affordable housing, people can avoid the homelessness or the psychotic breaks or the ER that costs the city so much money. So I think a substantial investment or increased investment in affordable housing is the way to go. And Mayor Bloomberg and actually incoming Mayor de Blasio have the same perspective, because Mayor Bloomberg said, I'm going to build 60,000 affordable units, and he did. And incoming Mayor de Blasio, I believe,
200,000.
is committed to a bigger number. So I think the facts are compelling, and on both sides of the political spectrum, if you like, it's out there. It's just a question of finding the sites, finding the will, and getting it done. But that'll have a dramatic impact.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple. The shelter in place is definitely the way we're going to. I mean, these people, this is their home. This is where they feel safest. I mean, they want to stay in their home. So we have, thanks to Enterprise, we've hired some engineering firms to look at our properties from a new perspective. You know, I'm in that building once a week, my staff are there every week. A new vision comes in and sees problems and sees solutions, and now we've got to chase after money to find it. Because if we can make these, if we can harden these buildings, if we can make them more resilient, if we can make them come back online a lot quicker, then yeah, I think people should stay in their homes, because I don't think shelters are ready for seniors and the frail elderly. On capacity, on demand, New York City is an aging city. There's a lot more people going to age in this city, and there's not a lot of new elderly housing being built. The HUD is the one source that I know that was building. We have a building that's 256 units, built in 1960 something. The last building we built was in 2004. HUD's now funding buildings 50 units. You know, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of a dent. We built that building, we had 4,000 applications. I had a 1-week application process, and we got 4,000 applications. My application deadline, we've closed them. We're beyond 15-year waiting list now. There is a huge pent-up demand for senior housing for folks who are living on Social Security and fixed incomes. This city needs to find some solution for that.
Great. Bomee, you want to add anything?
Sure. So a couple of things. I think on the front of, on the question of, you know, what role should the city take? I think the city, I think one of the most important roles that the city plays is in taking something that we all as practitioners are thinking about, that we think should be common practice, and to help push it over the threshold so that it becomes common practice in reality. And I know some of y'all are gonna come at me later to be like, the last thing I need is more HPD checklists. But when it comes right down to it, you know, the city does have the ability to add, you know, criteria to the city funding programs. It has the ability to provide resources to help implement those best practices. And it has the ability to keep us, by making it common practice, it has the ability to keep the practitioners focused on an issue as part of our regular process in the long run, so that, you know, when our attention, you know, when you know, the next storm has come and it isn't as bad, and we're all like, oh, great, you know, we're all prepared better, and it wasn't as good, or it wasn't as bad, and so, like, we're all cool. When we get to that point where we've kind of forgotten the immediate pain and lessons of Sandy, having things enshrined in, you know, the government programs can help us to make sure that we're not missing checking those boxes, you know, on that extra HPD checklist. So I think that that's a really important role that the city can play. The question of, you know, who should be bringing these communities to learn together, I think, you know, we should just all do that. You know, and one example that I want to highlight actually is actually Jersey City Housing Authority. So the Jersey City Housing Authority actually, on its own initiative, brought together a group of housing authorities that were affected by Sandy in New Jersey, and had a, you know, all-day meeting where they discussed the, you know, how each of the housing authorities had fared, you know, shared information about what worked well, what didn't quite work well, and they're building that, you know, that shared community of practice, you know, just because, you know, they see the value in doing that. So I think that, you know, all of us who see value in sharing information and learning together should just take the initiative and do that. And on this shelter-in-place question, we actually, my colleagues, a couple of my colleagues who work on the Sandy program are here with us today, and we actually just had a very long discussion yesterday about how we talk about shelter-in-place. On the one hand, you know, obviously, you know, health and life safety is paramount, right? Right. You know, if you're doing something and it's going to cause somebody to die, that's bad. And so when there's an evacuation order, we all have to take that very seriously, right? Because the folks who have been deputized, that, you know, from our society to tell us when things are going to get dangerous, have told you things are going to get dangerous and you should leave these areas. So we should take that seriously. On the other hand, there are the issues of, like, where are folks going to go? Are they going to feel comfortable going there? Are they going to fare well when they're there? There's also been some conversations in our field basically looking at the impacts of displacement on, for example, frail elderly, where they're evacuated, they have a very disorienting negative experience, they suffer consequences health-wise and and mentally after that. And so, it is not always the best choice, but what we definitely don't want to be doing is pulling that trigger, like, ad hoc, right? Like, you don't want to make that decision whether you whether you help people shelter in place or whether you try to help people get out. You don't want to make that decision like on a spur of the moment. As as organizations that have responsibility for portfolios of housing,
Or as government.
or as government, we should be, encouraging folks who have that decision-making power at the building level or at whatever scale, to have those thoughts in advance and have a plan, right?
Great. Thank you very, very much. I just want to thank our panelists up here for sharing your insights and your ideas. And, we're going to make sure that this gets to the transition tent as part of the de Blasio administration's implementation. Thank you very much.
So before everyone takes off, I just want to have a few closing words. I really took to heart what Bomee was saying about first looking at ourselves, then looking at our neighbors, then looking at others. And in that spirit, we need to leave today with the sense of hope. Everything that anyone discussed today, there was a glimmer of hope and promise that we can affect change, that the solutions are within our grasp. We just need to embrace them. In my work at Better, I should have introduced myself, Rob Conboy, I'm in the program. I've spent my time with entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs view the world not in a zero-sum game, but in the ideal that you can create something from nothing. And in that same spirit, the notion of social equity is the ideal that we can create something from nothing. And we need to elevate the conversation and leave today not with despair, but with hope. And in doing that, we have a Twitter hashtag of Financing NYC, and as well as the website rampfinancing.com. Rampfinancing.com is going to morph from just this event to a resource where we will post all of the presentations. There'll be a blog space for sharing of ideas. It's going to be a nexus, as one of the presenters discussed, for the furthering of these discussions. Today is not a single point in time. It's the beginning of a longer-term discussion. And in the future, you'll be hearing from folks like Steve and from Ron as to how do we move this dialogue forward. At the end of the day, it's about positive outcomes. It's about elevating our communities, realizing that while large events like Sandy do occur, we know that smaller events are going to occur as well. And we need to ensure that the riskiest of our communities are elevated, and then we are all elevated by having stronger, more resilient communities. So with that, I'd like to pass it off to Steve. Oh, and the evaluations.
Don't forget the evaluations. Never forget the evaluations. We promised to be through by 12:45, which we will do. There's another program in here starting at 1 o'clock. So I want to, on behalf of the New York City Bar Association, thank all of you very much for being here. I want to make a special effort to thank our two moderators for our second and third programs, Jesse and Michelle, who did an absolutely superb job in organizing their programs and eliciting truth and wisdom from all of their panelists. And I want to give them a special appreciation.
I need to thank Chris Rice, Kate Joseph, and York.
Oh, I also, yes, these are the other people from our program, from Chris and Kate and York, all of whom made this possible. None of you would be sitting here in such a well-organized program but for their efforts. But a very special thank you to Ron Schiffman, who moderated our first program. And who has walked the walk here for many years and had the inspiration for today's program, and is going to lead us as we work together in the future with all of you. From the City Bar Association, it's a pleasure to be able to work with you all, and I hope we will get to where we're going, which is the just and resilient New York in the future. Thank you very much.